Tēnā koutou katoa. As Bevan said, thanks for joining on a lovely Friday morning on a very important topic. I'm sure that if you've made it to this part of our advice with the different webinars that we've done, you know by now that the Climate Change Commission is an independent advisory body, and we are by legislation politically neutral, and we advise the government of the day, not any particular government. And the reason we do what work we do when we do it is because we are legislated to do so due to the wisdom of the Parliament in 2019 that updated the Act and put the wheels in motion from that date out to 2050. The Commission is a pretty simple piece of the machinery for the climate architecture. We really only do three things. We assess risk. You'll see that in our 2026 National Climate Change Risk Assessment that we're just starting to really work on hard now. Aside from assessing risk, we also advise on what's necessary and what's possible. We do that through our emissions reduction plans and our emissions budgets advice. And we also monitor progress and show whether the country is on track. And we monitor progress on the emissions reduction side annually and every 2 years for progress against the national adaptation plans that are in place at the time. Across this, three kinds of work that we do our best to identify challenges, opportunities, barriers, and solutions. Our mandate is to think broadly and consider many matters in performing these three simple types of tasks. The goal is to create advice and assessments that are grounded in evidence and engagement. We do our thing, give our advice, and then it is over to the government to make choices. Those choices naturally have consequences and outcomes, and the outcomes need to add up to the budgets of the day and the targets and progress against the adaptation plans. All of our work is available to the public. And we do our best to be incredibly transparent, forthcoming, and evidence-based about what is working and what isn't. With that being said, all of the reports and the modeling and the numbers and the details that we'll speak to today at a high level are available on our website. We're holding nothing back. So if you're wondering where something comes from, then give a quick Google and a few clicks. And if you can't find anything, then reach out and we'll help you find it. In this case that we're speaking to you about today, we've done our best to provide advice to help government with some big decisions. Government will use this advice to inform decisions it must make by the end of 2025. And these decisions will affect how New Zealand tackles climate change for the next 20 to 30 years. A few weeks ago, we walked down the street and handed over two big reports to the Minister's office. And they are separate, but they are incredibly related. The first one is on emissions budget 4. I'm sure you're aware, if you attended the webinar earlier this week, that emissions budgets are the 5-year caps that walk us out to get to our target. And the important thing about these budgets is they send long-term signals that influence short to medium-term decisions. We advised government where EB4 needs to be set, and in doing so, we also gave the government advice on if emissions budgets 1, 2, and 3, those that are in place now out to 2035, should be kept the same, or if there's a significant reason to revise them. Emissions budget 4 is important because it takes the country over halfway to the 2050 target timeline. And it's worth saying that the emissions budgets 4 advice is focused on the current target. The one that every time that we give advice on emissions budgets, so that's every 5 years, the Act also tells us that we should check if the target is fit for purpose as the guiding star of the climate architecture. So essentially, every 5 years, we do a signals check and look at significant topics that are outlined in the Act and assess whether things should be kept as they are or if there's merit in updating them due to a significant change in circumstances. This target review cycle matters a lot because it sets the direction of travel for the country. Government policy decisions will affect us all: lives, livelihoods, businesses, communities, and the environment. In a nutshell, before we get into the international shipping and aviation, which we say ISA to each other internally here. So if I end up throwing that acronym out, you'll know that I'm talking about the subject of the day. The 2050 target guides the system. The current target was set in by Parliament in 2019. It has three components: the net zero component for long-lived gases in 2050, a near-term target for methane, which is 10% less than 2017 levels by 2030, and then a range for biogenic methane in 2050, which is 24 to 47% of 2017 levels. After conducting our review, the Commission has recommended the target goes further. Our recommendation is that the net zero component of the target changes to -20 megatons by 2050 rather than net zero, and that the floor of the biogenic methane range rises from 24 to 35, but the top end at 47% remains the same. And we recommend that the 10% kind of glide path 2030 midpoint element of the target remains as it was. And importantly, further reductions and removals of all greenhouse gases are required by 2050. So I think that's the relevant window dressing, and it's time for me to go on mute and get out of the way so Martin and Rob can really get into the subject matter that you all have tuned in to hear about today.
Thank you very much, Barry. There's a really nice segue into the International Shipping and Aviation review that we're going to be doing today. So kia ora koutou, my name is Martin Dutton. I am the manager of the Reports Delivered team, and so it's the team that I've been working with that's actually put the advice out on international shipping and aviation emissions. So these emissions from international shipping and aviation are about 98 to 99% carbon dioxide, and they are contributing to climate change. Together, these emissions are equivalent to around about 9% of Aotearoa New Zealand's net zero emissions currently. That's all emissions, not just those of shipping and aviation. So if no action is taken to reduce these emissions, then by 2050, they're likely to grow to the equivalent of more than 1/3 of the country's domestic net emissions. Now, globally, we know that these emissions need to be addressed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. There's a couple of international bodies, the International Maritime Organization and the International Civil Aviation Organization, and these two bodies are actually coordinating action on these emissions at the global level. Both of the organizations have set net zero 2050 targets for shipping and aviation. So the International Civil Aviation Organization has pricing of these emissions in place already, and the International Maritime Organization is aiming to get the targets in place or the pricing in place by 2027. However, it's really important both of these global bodies encourage countries to go further by setting plans to help support emissions reductions in these sectors. So it can't be just left to the two organizations. Other countries in other jurisdictions like the UK, like the EU, and like the USA are all beginning to move in this space already. And they're doing this by setting goals and targets, as well as the policies that are needed to achieve the emissions reductions. So on to our advice itself. So we know that international shipping and aviation emissions are significant, and they're growing. From our analysis, we've concluded that it is both feasible and in Aotearoa New Zealand's best interests to include these emissions within the 2050 target. These emissions matter, as we just saw when we're discussing their emissions profile. So the Commission has advised that the government in this advice that Aotearoa New Zealand can and should do more to reduce these emissions. And this aligns with what we heard during our consultation as well. The choices that are made about international shipping and aviation emissions are important for our global reputation. It could affect the country's access to both overseas markets and the demand for exports and tourism if minimal action is taken to address these emissions. Other countries, as I said, are already taking action. So aligning with other jurisdictions protects New Zealand's tourism and exports. And it also meets the expectation of some major overseas customers who buy New Zealand products. Now, during our analysis, we considered four main components when determining exactly how to include international shipping and aviation emissions into the 2050 target. And that was how to count, it was how we would structure the target, we'd look at other climate impacts, and we'd look at the level of emissions reductions as well. So for the how, our advice is that government should adopt different measures to count emissions from international shipping vessels and aircraft. Now, this reflects what we heard during consultation, that the sectors are very, very different from each other, and they've got very different fueling profiles as well. So we heard that refueling for aviation, we decided that refueling for aviation is the best measure for how to count for planes, because planes need to refuel on each leg due to the storage, the weight, and some efficiency constraints as well. For ships, on the other hand, we've gone with the 50% to and from the next international port for shipping, and then 100% when we're going within New Zealand ports. So when they go from New Zealand port to New Zealand port. And the reason for this is that most vessels don't need to refuel in Aotearoa New Zealand. They can carry more fuel and weight without altering their efficiency profile significantly. For the second part on other climate impacts, our advice recommends that the government should reconsider these in the future. Currently, there's not enough scientific certainty or a consensus on the size of other climate impacts from international shipping and aviation for us to be certain that we should be including them. For the structure of the target, our advice is that the government include international shipping and aviation emissions within the net component of the 2050 target. The reason we're doing this is because the net component actually creates a clear and stable policy framework. And what we've done, if you read through the report, is we've actually recommended that the government should focus on these emissions specifically, and you can see that on this slide. For the last part of this, with the level of emissions reductions to actually aim for, we've advised that the target level should remain the same with these emissions included. So this means that for the current target, it will remain at net zero 2050, and for the proposed revision to the target from the 2050 target review, the target would sit at minus 20 megatons of greenhouse gases. So this target level is achievable and affordable. And there are also several benefits to reducing international shipping and aviation emissions, including cleaner air and protecting trade. So the Commission has opted to recommend measures that ensure accuracy and can track progress over time. We also considered, as part of our analysis, ways in which operators could be incentivized to produce and use alternative fuels, including domestically here in Aotearoa New Zealand. The measures that we recommend align with what other major economies in the space are already doing or have proposed doing. They also look at ways to avoid double counting of emissions, which is something that came up in our consultation. So as I've already mentioned, economies that have already started progressing the decarbonisation of international shipping and aviation through policy, through targets, through research and development include places like the United States of America, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and even Australia as well. So we've found that there are significant opportunities to reduce emissions, particularly those gross emissions within the net zero component of the target. So just going on to what we heard during our consultation, obviously we went out with a suite of potential options and the reasons why we thought that these could be potential options. And we actually heard what came back. We listened to submissions, and where these were feasible, we actually included those within our final advice. So just a very short summary of what we heard is that the majority of submitters actually preferred inclusion of international shipping and aviation within the 2050 target, having determined that Aotearoa New Zealand should take responsibility for its emissions. We've heard that alignment with other countries and other international organisations is really important. The International Maritime Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and other major economies are making progress in their means of reducing emissions from international shipping and aviation already. So we don't want to be left behind. We also heard the potential opportunities. So submitters wanted more domestic policy action to enable alternative fuels and fuel production and storage in New Zealand. Alternative fuels we considered in our advice include, but are not limited to, sustainable aviation fuels, biofuels, green hydrogen, green methanol, and green ammonia as well. Now, as Barry mentioned earlier, our role is not to actually determine the policy actions. Our role is to provide advice to the government. So we haven't got the specific policy actions that the government should take within the recommendations. For how to count emissions, fairness was a really key theme that came up within the submissions. We heard that no matter how we recommend international shipping and aviation emissions be included in the target, it should be done fairly across these sectors and operators, and also the operators that sit outside of international shipping and aviation. For the level of emissions reduction, we saw a clear preference for high ambition of those who provided a position. However, most of the submitters had no formal position on this. There were some key industry submitters that indicated that global models from the International Maritime Organization and the International Civil Aviation Organization adapted for Aotearoa New Zealand should be used to inform the level of emission reduction. I think the big thing that we heard was that technology will change significantly between now and 2050, and particularly in that 2040 to 2050 space. So the level of emissions reduction to aim for will need to be adjusted over time, and that whether the emission reductions can be achieved relies on the government taking those policy actions and taking them early. And then finally, we also heard that whether we advise the government to include international shipping and aviation emissions or not, there would be different impacts on individuals and businesses regarding the overall benefits to the country. So even if there is a net benefit, there will be people within that spectrum that benefit more than others. So we wanted to acknowledge this upfront. So how do we respond? Well, in line with the majority of the submitters that have actually fed back to us, we've recommended including the emissions in the 2050 target, and that the government should take specific action to address these emissions within that net zero component. We've recognised the importance of aligning our advice. So this includes the fact that the target may need revising over time to ensure that ongoing alignment with other countries, with the International Maritime Organization and within the International Civil Aviation Organization. We've used this information and the evidence in submissions to strengthen our analysis in key areas like alternative fuels, what the impacts of including the emissions in the target are, and how they should be included in the target as well. And our advice is in line with the majority of the submitters for how to count and also the target structure as well. So that concludes our little roundup. Now, I'm going to pass back to Bevan for any partai. Kia ora.
Yeah, kia ora tātou. So people might be wondering, does adding ISA emissions to the target mean I need to start accounting for them in my company or industry? Have we got someone who can answer that one, Barry?
Sure, Bevan. I'll jump in here. Many businesses are already having to account for these emissions as part of their Scope 3 emissions for reporting and as part of their overseas customer regulatory requirements. Of course, that's especially true for publicly traded companies or companies that have B2B relationships with those publicly traded companies. Adding these emissions to the targets, as we've recommended, brings what the government accounts for closer in line with what many businesses and customers already need to consider. So from that point of view, it should be an alignment kind of exercise rather than an additional one.
And what are other countries doing about these emissions? Barry?
Yeah, I think the quick answer is, as you'll find in the report, we spend a lot of time looking around the globe and looking at how to count and who's doing what. And I think the Coles notes are that major economies like the EU, as well as the UK, have set targets to reduce their emissions and put in place policies to meet these targets. Increasingly, other countries are also putting in place policies to reduce emissions from these sectors, including Australia, Singapore, Canada, and Japan. So I think, Bevan, it's a big topic, but I'll just leave it right there and then not go into how different countries are playing different roles in these organizations that Martin's talking about.
Oh boy. So we've got an audience question here. We are a fairly isolated country. We need to keep encouraging tourism, don't we?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words and then hand over to the smart people. I think that's a really fair observation. We took a lot of care in thinking about the economic and the social and the ecological circumstances and all of the things the Act tells us to consider anytime we do our work. I think that maybe in a nutshell, when we're just thinking about what is the world like now versus what could it look like if the government takes this advice, um, as Martin said, New Zealand is a member of the ICAO and IMO organizations. And as a member of those organizations, doing nothing is not really an option in this space. So I guess the question is, how does something happen in the future, and what role does the government want to take in terms of using agency or not, or letting the international organizations steer the proverbial ship? I know that's a tough metaphor with this topic, but I'll leave it out there. So I think maybe with that, I'll ask Rob or Martin to maybe talk with a little bit more about some of the scenarios and what does the tourism sector look like in some of those different states of the world that helped inform this advice.
Kia ora, absolutely. So we recognise the importance of tourism as a significant contributor to New Zealand's economy as we did our analysis, and in all of the scenarios that we modelled, we've projected the total use of aviation to increase from its current levels. So even in the scenarios where you might have some policies in place that are reducing demand, you'd still see overall growth in the sector, and tourism would continue to be a key contributor to New Zealand's economy into the future, even with further policies in place for international shipping and aviation emissions.
Yeah, through shipping and aviation, we look to get our presents delivered at Christmas time, and some of us might want to fly home and visit our relatives or take that cruise in the holiday season. So thank you. I've got another question. Peter Nuttall. Why does New Zealand consider the IMO CIO process sufficient evidence for assessing impacts of shipping measures?
Thanks, Bevan. I think I'm going to understand that question as how did we consider New Zealand's commitments or potential actions under ICAO or the IMO, rather than hopefully we don't have a CIA presence in the policy development process, but I guess one never knows. So I think, Rob, I'm going to hand over to you first while I get a chance to think about it. You have your fingers all over the details there.
Yes, absolutely. I think this question is referring to the comprehensive impact assessment process that the IMO is considering on the potential introduction of a levy for international shipping. So we've looked at that as part of our analysis, and in particular, it gives a really good steer on what the economic impacts of a high level of action on international shipping would likely to be. So even in their most extreme scenario, in that modelling of a levy of US $300 a tonne on shipping emissions, it showed only a 0.38% impact on prices as a result of that. So it gives a good sense of the potential economic scale of impact from taking action on these emissions. And we considered it as part of our analysis, but we didn't limit ourselves to only looking at international work as part of our considering the impacts. We also looked at New Zealand specific data for what the impacts could be, and talked to stakeholders about what they felt the impacts would be in this space if we were to include the emissions in the target.
So are historic shipping and aviation emissions required to update our target and NDC baselines? If so, how do you recommend historic shipping and aviation emissions are calculated, as MFE does not currently capture this data?
Yeah, thanks, Bevan. This is a thoughtful question. So maybe I'll answer at a high level and just about what's related to what, and then Rob, I know you guys did a lot of work about how to count things and how could that be done in the future. So just keep your powder dry for a second. So the first thing is, I'll just reiterate the fact that, so we've given this advice, and the government has up to 12 months to reply to it. So the first kind of answer for a question like that is, we'll have to see what happens first. Just because we've made this advice doesn't mean, anything should happen other than the government should consider it, and when it's making its decisions to update the target or not. And so that's the first thing. And the other thing is, it's fair to ask a question about NDCs because, that's obviously front of mind. The government's currently consulting on, or maybe it's finished now, if it just finished recently, on what kinds of information it will use to inform its second nationally determined contribution, that is the first half of the next decade. And of course, there's lots of awareness around the country now of the gap between our current emissions budgets 1 and 2, and the distance from those outcomes to what the country is committed to under the Paris Agreement under its first NDC. I say all that to get to the bullet point, or the key takeaway, that the government can take this advice on board as it sees fit, but this advice is related to the domestic legal architecture, and the NDC is related to New Zealand's commitment to the globe under the Paris Agreement, or to the parties, to the Paris Agreement. So they're similar, but they're not related, but there's not a directly if and then relationship, which is a little bit frustrating potentially, but that's the way this is. So we're trying to inform the 2050 legislative target under the NCCRA, but it's very fair to assume that any slippage or action that's taken into account under CCRA mandated events would also either make your NDC compliance experience more or less enjoyable in the future. Rob, over to you.
Yeah, I'd just add to that answer that for international aviation, the government does have the data on the refueling measure that we've proposed back to 1990. So that is data that they've been collecting the whole way through and can use for looking back at historic projections. For the domestic legislation, because we're not setting a fixed percentage reduction, we're looking at what it needs to be in 2050. You don't necessarily need the historic data all the way back for that target. What we have calculated whilst we were doing this work is back to 2019 historic data, but the government would be able to produce its own estimates going back to 1990 if it wanted that to inform its response and work in this space.
Kia ora. Thank you for that. The next question, the shipping 50% figure, is it 50% of fuel of both the arrival journey and the departure journey?
Thanks, Bevan. Rob, I'll hand straight to you on that one.
Yes, so it would be 50% of the fuel both to and from the next overseas port, and then whilst they were in New Zealand waters, 100% of the emissions that they were generating during that time.
Rob, can you say a little bit more about why international and in domestic waters? Because this is, naturally international shipping and aviation. The domestic version of these emissions are already covered under the current targets. So can you just fill in some of the gaps there? Because that's not obvious for maybe the layperson.
Yes, absolutely. So New Zealand has, to be considered within New Zealand's territory, it goes out to 12 nautical miles from the coast. So that waters is included as part of New Zealand when you think about it for what our emissions are. And then we have a wider area that goes out further and out to the continental shelf called the exclusive economic zone that we also have some control over. And then in between countries, you have international waters where no one country has responsibility and it falls under international rules only.
Thank you, Rob. So we have a fifth question here. Could we please have more detail on why the aviation and shipping has been recommended for inclusion?
Yeah, okay. So maybe I'll just take a step back about why we did this work, and then I'll pass over to Martin and/or Rob to talk about how we got to where we got to for the final advice. So in the two pieces of work that I spoke to earlier, the emissions budgets advice and the target review work, those are, every 5 years cycles out to 2050 and beyond that we shall do that work. When Parliament updated the CCRA in 2019, it legislated a one-off review of international shipping and aviation. So we will do this work one time only for delivery, in December of 2024. And then we won't look at this again unless we're directed to via legislation, or the government takes the advice that ISA emissions should be brought under the target, and then they would be considered in future target reviews and emissions reduction plans and budgets and monitoring reports, just like all the other emissions that are covered under the targets. So that's the why are we doing this? Why have we done this work? And then I'll pass over to Rob and Martin for why did you land where you did?
Just going to mention that the Commission actually works to the Climate Change Response Act. So all of our analysis is actually shrouded around Section 5M, and there are a number of different things that we take into consideration as part of the analysis. So we look at the current available scientific knowledge, we look at the existing technology, and any technological developments that are currently looking like they're feasible, and the costs and benefits as well. We look at the economic effects on New Zealand. We look at things like the social, cultural, the environmental, and the ecological circumstances as well. We look at the distribution of benefits, so the costs and the risks between generations. We look at the Crown Māori relationship and Te Ao Māori, and the specific effects on Māori. And we also look at responses to climate change that is actually taken by other parties to the Paris Agreement or to the Convention. So that's why we're looking at a range of different things, looking at a range of different organisations like the IMO and ICAO, and also other countries, other jurisdictions, and what they're doing as well. I'll pass over to Rob to just finish off on the actual why, and just give a little bit more detail about why we included that in the actual advice.
Yep, absolutely. Just following on from what Martin said, the key thing that we have to consider under the Act is what is necessary for New Zealand to contribute to global efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And so that's our key driver behind our recommendation, and we considered the various benefits and risks of taking action on these emissions by including them in the target. I think the key risk that really came up through feedback was around alignment with the international regime, and ultimately what we found on that is that including the emissions in the target is consistent with the international regime and is a way to help motivate action to support those international regimes, and that it doesn't need to be something that sort of encourages unilateral action that might undermine them. And that's something that we've tried to make clear through our report, that we sort of see those things working in tandem. And there's real benefits to including in the target in terms of making sure that you have consistent planning across all your areas of emissions reduction, rather than treating international shipping and aviation as something over to the side. There are additional impacts when you start looking at how you would include them, and as we've gone through the report, we've set out the relative benefits and risks through each of our assessments about how they could be included in the target.
Thanks, team. Can you talk a bit more about alternative fuels, green hydrogen, ammonia, methanol? Has modelling been done on their feasibility or viability, including production in New Zealand or imported fuel?
Yeah, sure thing. Rob, I guess this is another one for you. So if you want to direct people where to find the stuff they're really interested in, that would be helpful. But also maybe just give a nickel tour.
Yep, absolutely. So you can find more information on this in Chapter 9 in the report. The key thing here is that our role was not to conduct a feasibility assessment of every fuel type New Zealand could produce. So we haven't got a definitive answer on every single fuel type, whether or not that could be produced in New Zealand, but we looked at what information was available, at what could be viable, and what feasibility studies had been done. And from that work and from the feedback from submissions that we had, there are a number of fuels that look like they're viable to be produced in New Zealand. For sustainable aviation fuels, the government has released the initial findings of its feasibility study into woody biomass-based sustainable aviation fuels, which found that a plant to produce those is viable for New Zealand. In our commission modelling of how much woody biomass is available based on our forestry assumptions, you are looking at meeting about a third of fuel need based on what we see available from the woody waste and the lowest grade of logs that's available after you account for other uses of those fuels. And you could potentially increase that through things like short rotation forestry. Other fuel options that were highlighted through our work as potentially viable for New Zealand is municipal solid waste being used to produce aviation fuels, powder liquid aviation fuels, and on the shipping side, green hydrogen, green ammonia, and green methanol, where New Zealand already has some expertise in those fuels.
Thank you, Rob. What was the main pushback from submitters on inclusion of these sources to the targets?
Yeah, thanks, Bevan. I think the pedestrian answer to that is we did our best to really use the language about what we heard all throughout the report, where we speak to exactly to what we harvested through the consultation process with all the wisdom of the people that engaged us. So I think maybe, Rob, I'll ask you to point people directly in the report to where the control F, what we heard, would give them what they want to know specifically. I'll tell you my personal experience from having done quite a bit of consultation about this. One of the discussions that we ended up having a lot with high information stakeholders was the fact that the parameters of this target review and this assessment, and that's that it was just shall these emissions be included under the target. It didn't include by legislation the then what or what's next part of it. And those were fair questions for people to ask and want to provide input on. And it was, kind of as a policy wonk, frustrating that maybe some of those things would be part of future emissions reduction plans and not as part of the assessment that we just accomplished and handed in today. So I think that may be just the scope of the work rather than the content itself for me personally. But Rob, I'll pass over to you.
Absolutely. So you can find what we heard on chapter 8 of the document on page 147. And as Barry said, wanting more information about the exact impacts and the policies that might be in place was a key area of concern from some people, which is something that comes sort of later in the process, that you can really get down to that detail after a target has been set and you're looking at the detail of your budgets and plans to achieve it. Another area of feedback, as I mentioned earlier, was the alignment with the international regime, and we've sought to be clear in our final advice that if you're including these emissions in the target, it doesn't mean you should be ignoring the international regime. You should be working alongside it to deliver international shipping and aviation emission reductions.
Hey,
Yeah. With that being said, Rob, I think the one thing I would just add on is that while we heard a lot about the frustration with the exercise, there was a lot of support for what we went out to consult it on. So I wouldn't want anybody to take away from this quick trip down memory lane that we felt like we were really spitting into the wind out there. So I think that's just worth saying as a key takeaway.
Oh, well, thanks, team. Are we ready for the next question?
Sure thing.
Okay. Did the Commission also consider environmental impacts of ISA, or is this beyond your scope? Environmental impacts are huge, aren't they?
Yeah. As Martin said, the Act directs us to, I guess, what we say to ourselves in the Commission is we're directed to be thoughtful according to Section 5M of the Act, and environmental and ecological aspects is one part of it. I think that's so anytime we do any work, including this work, we take those things into account. And I know that especially with respect to in the marine sector, there are non-climate emissions related impacts associated with different particulate matter and different emissions from different fuels. So Rob, maybe I'll ask you to speak a little bit about some of those climate adjacent impacts that we took into account.
Absolutely. People can find this in Chapter 9 of the report. The main environmental and ecological impacts we considered was switching fuels within the international shipping and aviation sector delivers you a significant improvement in air quality, which is both beneficial for human life and for the environment. For international shipping, currently they make use of scrubbers to remove some of the sulfur pollution in their current fuels, which can have negative impacts on ocean life through changing the acidification of the ocean and some of the contaminants that can release. And if you switch to alternative fuels, then that can mean that there's not sulfur in the fuel to begin with, and so that technology is not required. And the other thing we were mindful of is that some of these new alternative fuels impose new risks of their own, and that can relate both to when they're produced and how they're used in the ship or plane. And so we considered what are those potential environmental risks that we might need to consider from alternative fuels, and how could those be managed as well?
On the wider scheme of things, all of the emissions equate to about 9%, isn't it, Rob? Okay, number 9, great work, climate team. Can you kindly advise if New Zealand military vessels and aircraft are included in this?
Rob or Martin, do you want to take that one on?
That wasn't something that we were asked to consider as part of this advice. Military missions do sit outside the target as well, but they are separated from international aviation and shipping emissions. So it's a separate question for the government to consider whether to bring those emissions in.
The earlier consultation material included some emphasis on the results of the EU and the UK work on the inclusion of aviation and relevant emission schemes. To what degree did your final analysis take into account the differences in the UK and EU settings compared to New Zealand? For example, alternative land-based means of transport across the EU area and wider that are not relevant for a geographically isolated country like New Zealand.
Yeah, I think that's a super fair point to make, and it really, I guess for us, that would be under the umbrella of the likely economic impacts, or what are the details that would affect or that would play into those economic impacts structurally. Rob, do you want to talk a little bit about the comparative analysis and how those different jurisdictions informed the advice that we eventually delivered?
Yes, absolutely. The UK is actually a really important example for New Zealand because it has the closest legislative environment to the Zero Carbon Act. And so it provides a really good guide on how international shipping and aviation emissions would interface with the legislation for how we think about our work. And whilst they are larger than New Zealand and closer to other countries, they're an island nation similar to us and have some other similarities in their economic circumstances. For the EU, recognising some of the submitted feedback around that, we removed some of the references that we had in the draft to the EU, and we've replaced those with further analysis that we've done of the domestic situation, as well as some more examples from Australia and some global modelling that took into account the different circumstances of countries like New Zealand, such as that done by the IMO. One thing that's important to note, though, is whilst other countries have other options like land-based transport, international shipping and aviation is the main form of international transport globally. Every country will need to take some action to address it in order for the IMO and ICAO's global goals to be met. Just replacing that transport with land transport for other countries is not a viable option in many cases, so they'll be looking to take equivalent action to us.
So our next question, shouldn't CCC recommendations about emissions targets to government be conditional on the availability of good alternative fuels?
It's maybe I'll just answer with how the target reviews are set up, and the fact that it's a fair point about, the target is way out there, and naturally, it's hard to predict the future, but the point of the target is to kind of be the guiding star, or the thing that the budgets and then the emissions reductions plans are hitched to in terms of direction of travel. And so there are many uncertainties between, tomorrow, or yesterday, and out there. I guess the tricky thing is conditional targets. I'm not sure if that approach, and I'm not going to philosophize about Parliament's wisdom in setting a point-year target, but there would be a good bit of difficulty with decision-making under uncertainty if business communities, households didn't know the direction of travel. So with that being said, the good thing about these target reviews is that they happen every 5 years. And just like Parliament set the original target in 2019, and then we've recommended an update because significant factors have changed, so too shall the same assessment be done in 5 years from now. And so just like the Commission made a recommendation for change just now, if new factors emerge and new situations prevail in technology, the economy, or society, then we would do our homework again accordingly. So there is absolutely no set it and forget it element here. This is a continuous, thoughtful experience for what does a good target look like for the country. Rob, did you want to say anything about alternative fuels and maybe what the research that we relied upon was speaking about for their potential arrival and how that relates to the different pathways?
Yeah, absolutely. So we modeled a number of different scenarios based on whether there could be low or high technology levels and whether there could be low or high levels of systems change. That's things like consumer demand changing. And broadly, we kind of have 3 different levels of alternative fuels that are assumed through different scenarios. At the lowest of the scenarios of change, it's 22%, which is sort of your minimum level of action. At the medium, it's a 70% assumption, which is in line with the EU's fuel standards that they've got in place, and the middle range scenario from the International Civil Aviation Organization for aviation. And at your top end, you've got 100% fuel switching assumption, which is in line with the USA's targets, and your highest emission scenario by ICAO, and from the international shipping side as well. Just adding the emissions to the target doesn't mandate that the sectors have to move to 100% alternative fuels. The level of fuels that would be adopted will depend on the policies put in place, and so that's part of the exercise of budgets and emission reduction plans that you go through after the target is set to determine that. We did look at what the availability could be for alternative fuels, and when you look at it at a global level across all the potential fuel types, there appears to be sufficient opportunity for the transition to happen. When you look at New Zealand specifically, you'd need a mix of different fuel types and some importing in order to reach 100%. So it depends on how much New Zealand could import and how much it could produce domestically. And achieving those levels of production relies on governments putting in place the policies that will incentivize that production to occur. It won't just happen in a vacuum from global technology change overall.
Thanks, team. So question number 12, do you have recommendations on where to source shipping data for use in private GHG emissions reporting?
Rob, I know we spoke a little bit about data sources and calculations. Do you want to just, I guess, help out our private sector colleagues here?
Yeah, for ours, we created our own estimate using customs data and a number of other sources, so it's probably not a very helpful exercise for the private sector, but there are a number of third-party companies that this data can be purchased from. Yeah, just shopping around to find the company best for you, but for our own estimates, we produced our own figures for this.
I think it's worth saying all the supporting materials and the modeling and the analysis and everything is up on our website now. And if folks can't find something that they think should be there, then give us a ping at hello@climatecommission.govt.nz, and we'll get back to you to let you know where to find stuff or to direct you otherwise that we may have learned in our travels.
Okay, we've got another question here. I appreciate comments on the importance of tourism to the New Zealand economy and ultimately the need for New Zealanders to connect to the world over water via sea or air. Did the Commission consider the different geography New Zealand has in terms of geographic distance, reliance on air-sea transport, and the current lack of options for sustainable long-haul fuels here, and advice to include emissions and targets? Seems like the advice has a lot of reference to economies with less isolation and more access to alternative fuels.
Yeah, so I think that's a fair point to raise, that every country is different and has their own unique circumstances. I think with respect to the current access to alternative fuels and where those supply chains might emerge, there's no reason to believe that the next 5 years will look like the last 5 years. But with that being said, Rob, do you want to talk a little bit about the modeling work and some of the assumptions and the scenarios?
Yeah, I can say all of those are things we considered. So, you know, the fact that New Zealand is much further away from other countries means that options like green hydrogen are unlikely to be a suitable option for New Zealand for international travel in the future, but could be an option for Europe, for example, impacted in where we landed on what types of fuels might be appropriate and what the transition might look like. The landscape for alternative fuels is really one that depends on the domestic policy environment put in place. We know that from our engagement that we did as part of working on the report, that there are alternative fuel producers that are interested in New Zealand as a potential location to set up and produce alternative fuels here, but they need the right regulatory environment in place for that to be an attractive option for them. But New Zealand has the potential feedstocks and electricity supply that could enable them to be produced here if there was the right regulatory environment in place for that. And in Australia, that's something that the government is making significant moves on in that space. And so we have noted within the report that that could be something worthwhile for the New Zealand government and the Australian government to collaborate around. And there were some signals of that in the recent 2+2 between New Zealand and Australia.
Look, I think we've got time for maybe one more question. Are we considering land use as part of our plan to use alternative fuels such as biofuel, i.e. the impact of losing land or forests if we or another country grow crops for biofuels?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words because that is a countrywide, multi kind of perspective, thoughtful question. And the fact is that you know, there's lots of different parts of the energy economy right now that are looking at biofuels as a way to decarbonize, whether that's boilers that make milk powder or you know, big generators that make electrons. And in this case, people are eyeing up different, you know, potentially forested land masses to provide fodder for sustainable aviation fuels. You're right, there is also a potential, you know, for food versus fuel nexus kind of trade-off that other parts of the world have already kind of hit squarely in the face. So I think it is very relevant to raise that. The I guess the Commission's answer is we do take those things into account when we, for example, would look at factors like this in drafting up our next emissions reduction plan or looking at the impacts of current emissions reduction plans in our annual monitoring reports. It is related, it is relevant, and I think those impacts are at the nub of how New Zealand is going to try to take its next steps on the energy transition to get away from high emission sources of fuel towards lower ones, and where should those lower emission sources of fuels be used when you consider other potential alternatives where electrification is an option for some places, green hydrogen is an option for some places, and in other places, it's not an option for all kinds of operational and economic reasons. Rob, did you want to say anything else on that one?
Yeah, just that from our research and engagement, we didn't see strong interest in exploring crop-based alternative fuel production within New Zealand. There was some work that looked at maybe a small amount of sugar beet, but primarily where there's been interest is in woody biomass-based municipal solid waste and e-fuels in New Zealand that are produced using green hydrogen from electricity and water, and potentially captured CO2 off industrial plants. We did flag in the report that there are some environmental concerns. We do have crop-based alternative fuels. In our modelling for a high technology, high systems change scenario, there would be enough woody biomass from waste wood and low-grade logs after other uses to supply about a third of demand. You could increase that further with short rotation forestry in addition in the woody biomass space, and Scion has done some work in that space that indicate you get reasonably large energy volumes from quite a small volume of land. So that would be an option available to the government in future if they did want to go down that route.
Okay, I'll thank you there, presenters. Thanks very much. The teams behind the scenes, our analysts, comms team, but thank you, the audience, for your participation and your excellent questions. Yeah, miharo.